If Hitler was so terrible, why didn't the Germans overthrow him? There is a question often raised. Why did the German people support Hitler for so long? Of course, there were assassination attempts targeting the Nazi German Führer, but we don't see the German populace rising up in rebellion to seize power in the way they had done before to overthrow the monarchy, marking the end of the German Empire. The Germans could have even prevented the Nazis from taking power in 1933 through their own votes, but they did nothing. If Hitler was truly so terrible, why didn't the Germans topple him sooner? First of all, this video is not meant to whitewash Hitler and the Nazis. The crimes he and his cronies committed are unforgivable. However, only by understanding why this fascist leader rose to supreme power and maintained it until his death with the support of the people can we prevent similar disasters in the future. There is a lesser-known story, or one that is deliberately forgotten, that the Nazis came to power through the votes of the German people. Hitler was also not the first to carry out large-scale attacks against Jews. Such actions had been carried out long before, thousands of years before this Führer was even born. Anti-Semitism was not something invented by him and his associates either. Throughout history, many rulers, empires, and nations have oppressed their Jewish populations or sought to completely eliminate Jewish people. The methods used ranged from expelling Jews to outright attacking them. The history of anti-Semitism includes the First Crusade, which led to widespread attacks on Jews, the Spanish Inquisition led by Thomas de Torquemada, the Portuguese Inquisition with its persecutions and acts of faith against New Christians and Marano Jews, the Kishinev pogrom, the pogroms instigated by Russian Tsars, as well as the expulsions of Jews from Spain, Portugal, England, France, Germany, and other countries where Jews had settled. Furthermore, during Hitler's time, the concept of national superiority was quite common as a justification for invasions. Racism thrived in the first half of the 20th century, normalizing attacks on weaker ethnic groups by the bourgeoisie in these countries. It was also a way to divert attention and alleviate class conflicts between the bourgeoisie and proletariat. There were even human zoos to display colonized people, just to prove one's superiority. For the Germans, they didn't necessarily approve of the Nazis' large-scale attacks. However, it's worth noting that other great powers committed similar crimes against weaker nations, and no one was ever brought to trial for it. If this seems exaggerated, remember that no one demanded the overthrow of the British government for the Bengal famine of 1943 or the earlier mega-famines in India, despite some sympathy, or rather, a few protests. We need to distinguish clearly between bad and evil. Hitler was evil toward other nations, especially the races he deemed inferior. However, he was not a bad leader. A bad leader would not have been able to bring a nation in crisis back to being a great power. A bad leader would not have been able to manipulate Britain, France, and even the Soviet Union into trusting him to the point that they were completely caught off guard when attacked. A bad leader would not have been able to create millions of jobs for his people. He truly loved his nation, so much so that he was willing to burn the world down to ensure the happiness of the German people if necessary. First, let's look at things from the perspective of the Germans to understand why Hitler was able to seize absolute power. In reality, it was very difficult for an ordinary person not to support the Führer given the historical context I will describe below. After World War I, or as it was called at the time, the Great War, Germany lost. They were held responsible for starting the war, forced to pay reparations, and their military was restricted. To the Germans, this was clearly a farce. Were the French held responsible for Britain's colonization of Indochina? Were the British held accountable, forced to pay reparations, or had their military restricted for invading India? Were the Americans held responsible for driving many Native American tribes to extinction on their own land? The fact that the Germans were punished for doing things that the British, French, and Americans had done clearly seemed unfair. The Germans knew this was absurd. However, the alternative was to continue the war, which was impossible given the nation's depleted strength. so the only option was to sign the peace treaty and accept the unreasonable conditions, which were obviously intolerable. Naturally, many were unwilling to accept this, as Germany was still standing yet forced to sign such a humiliating treaty, and Hitler was just one among them. During the period starting in 1923, the German government had to borrow money to pay off enormous debts. The reason was that payments were not accepted in German marks, but only in gold and foreign currencies. The government had to use unsecured Prussian marks backed by government debt. As a result, the currency was severely devalued, leading to the worst hyperinflation in Europe. Spanish journalist Eugenio Xamer, who witnessed this event firsthand, wrote, "Every week, the price of tram tickets, beef, theater and school fees, newspapers, haircuts, sugar, and butter went up. The consequence was that no one knew how long the money they had would last, and people lived in constant anxiety. No one thought of anything other than eating, drinking, buying, and selling. The only topic discussed in Berlin was the dollar, the mark, and prices. Do you see? I just bought sausages, ham, and cheese for the next mid-month." However, this was not the worst of it. At its peak, people used money to burn instead of firewood, as coal or wood was worth more than the rapidly devaluing currency. Children used money to make kites instead of paper. Fortunately, the government eventually managed to stabilize the economy, and things gradually improved. However, just a few years after Germany struggled to stabilize following this event, the Great Depression hit. Keep in mind that even victorious powers with colonies like Britain, France, and the United States were grappling with the crisis. So a nation like Germany, stripped of its colonies and burdened with war reparations, would obviously face an even more catastrophic disaster. Many families fell into hardship. The German government at the time tried to address the situation, but they only managed to keep the economy from collapsing, rather than alleviating the suffering of the people. After the 1930 election, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning's government was granted the power by President Hindenburg to act without parliamentary approval. Brüning's government pursued austerity and deflationary policies, leading to an unemployment rate of nearly 32% by 1932, without even improving the economy, which left the populace disillusioned with the Weimar Republic. To the Germans, the nation was heading down a dead end. In this context, a political force led by an individual emerged. This was a veteran who had fought in World War I. According to rumors, this man had been blinded by poison gas, but upon hearing of Germany's surrender, his patriotism restored his sight. Yes, this man was none other than Adolf Hitler. Unlike contemporary politicians, Hitler convinced the German people that he could solve their current problems. Meanwhile, the other political forces lacked the ability to appeal to the masses, as they couldn't find solutions to Germany's dire situation. In fact, before starting a war to redraw the world map, Hitler had indeed planned to address Germany's issues, as he had promised the people. Unemployment dropped from 6 million in 1932 to 1 million in 1936. Hitler oversaw one of the greatest infrastructure improvement campaigns in German history, including the construction of dams, the Autobahn, highways, railways, and other civilian projects. In May 1933, Reichsbank President and Minister of Economics Dr. Hjalmar Schacht devised a scheme to fund projects by issuing promissory notes, known as Mefo bills. Essentially, the Reichsbank printed money to cover payments. While this caused national debt to skyrocket, Hitler and his economic team were expected to embark on territorial expansion in the near future, which would provide the resources to pay off the debt. Under Schacht's management, unemployment fell rapidly, faster than in any other country during the Great Depression. The Nazi regime declared that they had solved unemployment, creating jobs for about 600,000 people. Of course, this came at a cost. From the mid to late 1930s, Germany's per capita income slightly declined compared to the Weimar Republic era, while the cost of living rose by 25%, and the average working hours per week increased. During the transition to a war economy in 1939, the average German worked 47 to 50 hours a week. Those who refused the harsh labor policies were sent to concentration camps by the regime. Nevertheless, at least the people had jobs and could support themselves and their families. Additionally, the Führer began to slowly erase the shame of defeat. In October 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations and the World Disarmament Conference. In January 1935, over 90% of the Saarland population, then under League of Nations administration, voted to reunify with Germany. In March of that year, Hitler announced the expansion of the Wehrmacht to 600,000 troops, 6 times the limit allowed by the Treaty of Versailles, along with the development of the Luftwaffe Air Force and the expansion of the Navy. Britain, France, Italy, and the League of Nations condemned Germany's treaty violations, but were powerless to stop them. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of June 18 allowed the German Navy's tonnage to reach 35% of the British Royal Navy's. Hitler called the signing of this treaty the happiest day of his life, believing it marked the beginning of the Anglo-German alliance he had predicted in Mein Kampf. Britain's signing of this treaty without prior consultation with France and Italy directly undermined the League of Nations, rendering the Treaty of Versailles ineffective. Through this policy, industrial tycoons secured lucrative contracts, and the massive military expansion created yet another large pool of jobs. Unemployment, which had already been decreasing, continued to drop significantly, as countless people were hired to work in factories producing weapons and military supplies. Furthermore, unemployed youth, or those unwilling to work in factories, could join the Wehrmacht, provided they met the Führer's racial superiority standards. By nearly solving unemployment and eliminating the military restrictions that had humiliated the Germans, the Nazi regime and the Führer himself saw a dramatic surge in public adoration. While not everyone approved of the fascist regime's brutal policies, human nature is inherently selfish, and few were willing to risk their own lives and those of their families for others, especially against someone who was giving them a slightly better life. At this point, calling for the German people to unite and overthrow Hitler was almost unthinkable. Of course, building a massive military, while creating many jobs, would also place a massive burden on the economy if left idle. And for that reason, the Nazis devised a plan for a future war to redraw the world. The next phase demonstrated Hitler's diplomatic shrewdness, as he realized that aging empires like Britain and France would not initiate war against Germany unless attacked first. The Great War had already been too much for them, and these two powers could not afford another conflict. On the other hand, Western capitalist forces wanted Germany to attack the Soviet Union, and indeed, Hitler did so. However, this was only after he had conquered most of Europe. Fundamentally, Germany's humiliation from World War I had been avenged. Territories lost to other nations were reclaimed, and Nazi Germany even occupied France, something the German Empire of the past had failed to do. In this situation, there was no reason for the Germans to overthrow Hitler, as he had kept all his promises to the people. Yes, the Nazi policies were unacceptable. Note, however, that the concentration camps were obscured from the public by the achievements of Nazi Germany under Hitler's leadership. When World War II broke out, and Nazi Germany showed signs of defeat, there were indeed numerous assassination attempts on Hitler. However, the people continued to fight to the end under Nazi orders. At this point, it was no longer entirely about Hitler. The Germans were fighting to defend their homeland. They did not want to surrender without a fight, only to be forced to sign another series of humiliating peace treaties as they had after World War I. Overthrowing Hitler at this stage was essentially unnecessary and would only have caused more chaos, leaving Germany leaderless against its enemies. And for that reason, the Führer was able to hold supreme power until the very end. In conclusion, the crimes of Nazi Germany and Hitler himself are unforgivable. However, we must also acknowledge that the Führer was a highly capable individual. What do you think? If you enjoyed this, please like and share the video.